Racist woman refuses to sit near black kid on a plane. Turns out his dad owns the airline. The airport was alive with its usual symphony of sounds, luggage wheels clattering across the floor, the chatter of travelers hurrying to their gates, and the distant hum of flight announcements echoing through the terminal. The hum of jet engines echoed across the busy terminal as passengers rushed to their gates. Bright lights reflected off the polished floors, and the PA system announced final boarding calls for flights departing to destinations all over the world. In the middle of the bustling crowd, an 11-year-old boy named Liam Reeves walked confidently toward Gate 23, clutching his small backpack like a prized possession. Liam Reeves walked beside his father. This wasn't just any trip for Liam. It was his first time flying alone. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he looked around, taking in the buzz of activity. For him, this was an adventure. But little did he know, this flight would be more than a journey through the skies. It would be a lesson in courage and a test of resilience. Jonathan Reeves, a tall, confident man dressed in a sharp but simple suit, was the picture of calm as he walked with his son. While most people only saw a regular businessman, Jonathan was far from ordinary. As the owner of the airline Liam was about to board, he had built his empire on hard work and humility from the ground up. As the owner of one of the largest airline companies in the country, he was no stranger to hard work and responsibility. But today he wasn't the businessman overseeing his fleet. He was a father, proud and slightly nervous, as he prepared to send his son on this new adventure. Jonathan kneels to meet Liam at eye level, his expression warm but firm. "Remember, son," he says, "be polite, keep your cool, and if you need anything, just ask the flight attendants. They're there to help you." Liam nods enthusiastically, his excitement bubbling over. "I'll be fine, Dad. You'll see." "You'll be great, buddy," Jonathan said with a smile. "Enjoy the view from the window. You've got this." Liam nodded eagerly, his confidence soaring as he hugged his dad one last time before walking toward the gate. Jonathan smiled, ruffling his son's hair. He had no doubt that Liam would handle himself well, but as he watched him approach the boarding gate, a flicker of worry crossed his mind. "What?" Liam stepped onto the plane, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. The flight attendants greeted him warmly, noticing his youthful enthusiasm. He found his seat by the window, marveling at the view of the tarmac below. Liam is greeted warmly by the flight attendants as he steps onto the plane. He hands over his boarding pass, and one of them escorts him to his window seat in economy class. It is starting to rain again. Liam's excitement was infectious. He couldn't wait to see the clouds from above, to feel the rush of takeoff, and to tell his dad all about it when he landed. He settled into his seat, pulling out his book and glancing around the cabin with curiosity. Passengers shuffle down the aisle, finding their seats and stowing their luggage. The air is filled with the usual sounds of boarding, a mix of chatter, overhead compartments clicking shut, and announcements from the crew. Liam's seat was perfect. The window offered a front-row view of the planes preparing for takeoff. He settled in, pulling out a book from his backpack, ready to enjoy the flight. But the peace didn't last long. The world wasn't always kind, and sometimes people judged too quickly and too harshly. Among the passengers was Margaret, a middle-aged woman with a perfectly styled bob and an air of self-importance. She walked briskly down the aisle with an air of entitlement, scanning the seat numbers, her expensive handbag swinging at her side. As she scanned the seat numbers, Margaret stops abruptly as she reaches her assigned seat. Her eyes land on Liam, who is quietly flipping through the pages of his book. Her expression changes immediately, from neutral to one of visible discomfort. Margaret's lips tightened as she took in the scene, a young black boy seated next to her, oblivious to her presence. She glanced at her boarding pass again, hoping there was a mistake. But there wasn't. Margaret stared at the boy for a moment, her brows furrowing. "Is this my seat?" she muttered under her breath, checking her ticket again. She sighed dramatically, her frustration evident as she waved over a flight attendant. As she flags down a flight attendant, her voice tinged with irritation. "Excuse me," she says, holding up her ticket. "There's been a mistake. I can't sit here." The flight attendant, a young woman with a warm smile, checks Margaret's ticket and assures her that she is indeed in the correct seat. "I need a different seat," Margaret insisted, her tone sharpening. "I can't sit next to him." She gestured toward Liam, who looked up from his book, confused but silent. The flight attendant, a young woman with a friendly demeanor, glanced at Margaret's ticket. She confirmed that the seat assignment was correct. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the attendant said politely, "but this is your seat. The flight is fully booked, so there aren't any other options." Margaret's face hardened. "You're telling me I have to sit here?" she asked, her voice rising. Her gaze flicked toward Liam, who was quietly reading his book. "This is unacceptable." Liam looked up, sensing the tension but unsure of what he had done wrong. He offered Margaret a polite smile and said, "Hi, ma'am." Margaret ignored him, turning back to the flight attendant. Liam's smile faded. He had done nothing wrong, yet he could feel the woman's disdain like a weight in the air. Around them, passengers began to glance over, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. Liam's excitement began to waver. He had been so eager for this flight, but now, the woman's coldness made him feel small. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, wondering what he had done to upset her. Margaret insisted that she couldn't sit next to Liam, claiming vague, personal reasons. The flight attendant, trying to remain professional, apologized, but explained there was nothing she could do. Passengers nearby began to take notice, their whispers filling the cabin as they watched the scene unfold. "This is unacceptable," Margaret snapped. Her frustration grew. "I want to speak to someone in charge," she declared, her voice loud enough for half the plane to hear. "I shouldn't have to deal with this." The flight attendant nodded politely. "I'll notify the captain," she said, her tone calm despite the growing tension. Margaret crosses her arms, glaring at Liam as if he's the cause of her troubles. Liam kept his eyes on his book, pretending not to hear her, but the hurt was clear on his face. Around them, passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some shaking their heads at Margaret's behavior. The tide was low, and the next approach was here. Liam let out a sigh of relief. Imagine being Liam, just a kid, excited for his first solo flight, only to be met with coldness and rejection. How would you handle a situation like this? Click the subscribe button now and let us know your thoughts in the comments. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Margaret sat stiffly in her seat, her arms crossed and her face set in a grim expression. Liam, unsure of what he had done wrong, kept his gaze focused on his book. But even he could feel the heavy air of judgment radiating from his seatmate. For everyone else in the cabin, the drama was only beginning. Margaret wasn't done. The thought of spending an entire flight next to Liam seemed unbearable to her. She leaned toward the flight attendant, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "I'm telling you, this isn't going to work," she said. "He's probably going to be loud, disruptive, and make this flight miserable. Find me another seat." The flight attendant, maintaining her professionalism, explained again that there were no available seats. She reassured Margaret that Liam had been nothing but polite and quiet so far. Margaret rolled her eyes. "That's what they always say. Just wait until the plane takes off." Zin. Liam's hands tightened around his book as he overheard Margaret's words. He wasn't sure what she meant, but he knew it wasn't good. Despite the growing unease, he decided to remain silent, just as his dad had taught him, to rise above, even when others were unkind. Frustrated by the lack of options, Margaret raises her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I don't know why this is so hard," Margaret exclaimed. "I paid good money for this ticket, and I shouldn't have to deal with this. If you can't find me another seat, maybe I'll just take another flight." Passengers began whispering among themselves. Some glanced at Liam with sympathy, while others looked at Margaret with disapproval. The flight attendant, trying to de-escalate the situation, offers Margaret water and suggests that she try to relax. "Relax?" Margaret snapped. "How can I relax when I've been put in this situation? I'll tell you one thing, this airline has terrible service." Her words hung in the air, heavy with entitlement and disdain. Liam glanced out the window, pretending not to hear, but the sting of her words was hard to ignore. Despite the tension, Liam remained calm. He clutched his book a little tighter, his small shoulders stiff but composed. He remembered his father's advice: always stay polite, no matter what. It wasn't easy, but Liam knew he had to hold his head high. Passengers nearby began to take notice, not just of Margaret's behavior, but of Liam's quiet dignity. One woman, seated across the aisle, leaned toward the flight attendant and whispered, "That boy hasn't done a thing wrong. Why is she acting like this?" One at the front of the plane pointed to the girl in front of him and said, A middle-aged man in the row behind Margaret clears his throat loudly. "Ma'am," he says, his tone sharp, "you're making a scene over nothing. The kid is just sitting there, reading a book." Margaret whips her head around, glaring at the man. "Excuse me? Are you seriously telling me how to feel?" The man shrugged, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just saying, maybe you should take a look at yourself. This isn't a good look for you." Other passengers murmur in agreement, and Margaret's face flushes with embarrassment. But instead of backing down, she doubles down. "You don't know what you're talking about," Margaret hissed. "I'm just trying to have a peaceful flight, and this isn't it." Liam, hearing the words but staying silent, gripped his book tighter. He wasn't sure why Margaret seemed so upset, but he knew one thing. He hadn't done anything wrong. Recognizing that the situation isn't improving, the flight attendant informs Margaret that she'll notify the captain if the behavior continues. Margaret, feeling emboldened, smirks and says, "Good. Maybe he can find me a better seat." But what Margaret didn't know was that the captain wasn't the only person who'd be hearing about this. A message was already on its way to someone much more important, someone who had a personal stake in the situation. In first class, Jonathan Reeves, Liam's father and the airline owner, sits quietly reviewing work on his tablet. His calm is interrupted by a discreet knock from the lead flight attendant. She explains the situation in a hushed voice, and Jonathan's expression hardens. He puts down his tablet and says, "Take me to the back." Jonathan Reeves wasn't just any father. He was a man who had built his empire on respect, inclusivity, and fairness. Hearing that his son was being treated unfairly didn't just upset him, it ignited a determination to make things right. As Jonathan makes his way toward the economy section, Margaret continues to mutter complaints. She accuses the flight attendants of being unprofessional and blames the airline for poor service. Liam remains silent, but his posture speaks volumes. He's uncomfortable, but he refuses to cry or show weakness. The cabin was heavy with tension as Margaret leaned back in her seat, her arms crossed and her expression smug. To her, the matter was simple. She shouldn't have to sit next to someone like Liam. But what Margaret didn't know was that her every word and action had already reached someone far more powerful than she could imagine. Passengers exchanged glances, their disapproval of Margaret growing with every word she uttered. But Margaret, wrapped in her own entitlement, didn't notice. She was too busy planning her next complaint. Just as Margaret begins another tirade, the cabin goes quiet. Passengers turn their heads as Jonathan enters the economy section, his presence commanding attention. Jonathan Reeves didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His calm authority was enough to silence the murmurs in the cabin. As he approached Liam's row, Margaret looked up, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. What would you do if you were in Jonathan's shoes? Imagine walking into a situation where your child is being unfairly judged. How would you handle it? Have you clicked on the subscribe button yet? Click on it now if you believe Margaret judged Liam unfailingly, and one should never be judged by their color anywhere. Jonathan Reeves, the owner of the airline, had heard many complaints in his career, but this one was personal. As he walked down the aisle toward Liam's row, passengers began to notice him. Some whispered to one another, recognizing the man whose face had been featured in interviews and magazines. Jonathan wasn't the kind of man to flaunt his wealth or power, but his presence alone commanded attention. Behind him, a tall bodyguard followed at a respectful distance, adding an air of gravitas to the moment. Margaret, unaware of Jonathan's identity, continued to grumble. She waved over another flight attendant, demanding an update. Wallace asked a confidential question. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "How long do I have to wait for someone to handle this?" The flight attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Jonathan as he approached. But Margaret didn't notice. She was too busy voicing her irritation to anyone who would listen. Casualty? But it was the tall bodyguard following closely behind that made passengers sit up straighter in their seats. Jonathan reached Liam. He bent down, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Liam looked up, his face lighting up with relief. "Hey, champ," Jonathan said softly. Margaret's irritation turned to confusion as she watched the interaction. Who was this man? And why was he here? But before she could say anything, Jonathan straightened up and turned to her, his expression calm but piercing. Margaret, still oblivious, tried to regain her composure. "Oh, good. Are you with the airline? This young man has been causing issues, and I'd like to change my seat." The cabin fell silent as Jonathan's lips curved into a faint smile. "I am with the airline," he replied evenly. "But I'm not just any employee. I'm Jonathan Reeves, the owner of this airline." Margaret's face drained of color as the weight of his words sank in. Passengers around her gasped quietly, their expressions a mix of shock and satisfaction. "The owner?" Margaret stammered. She glanced between Jonathan and Liam, her confusion deepening. "Then why are you here?" Jonathan's smile faded. "Because this young man you've been complaining about is my son," he said, "and I'd like to understand exactly why you felt the need to single him out." Before Margaret could respond, a woman across the aisle spoke up. "I can tell you why," she said, her tone sharp. "It's because she judged him the moment she saw him. That boy hasn't done a thing wrong." Another passenger chimed in, nodding toward Liam. "He's been nothing but polite the whole time. She's the one making a scene." Liam replied. Margaret turned red, her attempts to explain herself faltering under the weight of the passengers' accusations. Jonathan took a deep breath, his voice steady as he addressed the entire cabin. "What happened here today isn't just about my son. It's about the way we treat one another. Prejudice and assumptions have no place on my airline, or anywhere else." Passengers murmured in agreement, their respect for Jonathan growing. "Dad?" Liam said, his voice a mix of surprise and gratitude. The single word caught Margaret off guard. She turned to look at Jonathan, her eyes narrowing as if trying to place him. "I have you." Jonathan places a reassuring hand on Liam's shoulder before turning to Margaret. Jonathan's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of authority as he spoke. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Passengers around them froze, their whispers fading into silence. Margaret